Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event. I'm Dan Fishbein, president of Sun Life U.S., and we're thrilled to be able to bring you updates and insights, as well as answers to your questions about the COVID-19 vaccines. With me here today are two renowned guest speakers and medical experts. I'm thrilled to introduce both Dr. Benjamin Linas and Dr. Michael Rosenblatt, and thank you both so much for joining us here today. Dr. Linas is an associate professor of medicine and epidemiology at the Boston University School of Medicine, which is my alma mater, and an infectious diseases doctor at Boston Medical Center. Dr. Rosenblatt is on the board of fellows of one of the other medical schools in Boston, which is Harvard, and he also serves as chief medical officer at Flagship Pioneering. Earlier in his career, Dr. Rosenblatt was direct head of R&D at Merck, and quite notably, one of the portfolio companies at Flagship Pioneering is Moderna. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So we're going to spend the bulk of our time today getting into questions that the audience submitted in advance, as well as a few questions that we have. Thank you to everybody who sent them in. And if you have additional questions during today's presentations, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try to get to some of those a little later in the session. And just to give everybody sort of the logistics here, we're going to go until 12:50 Eastern time. So about a little more than 45 minutes from now. So with that, we'll get started with the first question, which I'm going to address to both of you. How would you define the current state of the pandemic in the U.S.? Dr. Linas, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure, happy to. Good question. I think it's a big moment in the pandemic. I hope I'm certainly more optimistic than I was last fall. I'm trying to think of a sports analogy, and I think we're somewhere in the middle of the third quarter or somewhere on the back nine, like maybe the 15th hole, I hope. But I would also point out, if you're a golf fan, that's when it starts to get serious, right? You have to get to that 15th hole and be in contention before you can really start thinking about ending the tournament and being the championship, and at risk of flogging this metaphor to death. I do think that that's where we are now. It's a critical moment. I'm sure we'll talk more about variants of concern, and those things are starting to emerge. It really is important that we accelerate the pace of vaccination to really minimize as much as possible this time period where we simultaneously have pressure on the virus from the vaccines and also on the ongoing replication and transmission in the community, because that is the recipe in virology that leads to variants emerging. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic for the summer, but we have a lot of work to do if we're going to make that happen.
Okay, great, thanks. Dr. Rosenblatt, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree with that. I think we're, we as a nation, in terms of our policy and our population's behavior, we've looked to vaccines as the solution. We haven't really done the other things that we could have done. Now, those vaccines in record time are becoming available. They are clearly having impact. But as we kind of put pressure on the virus, that's when the opportunity for variant strains, the most aggressive ones, to emerge. So that territory is unknown, uncharted. And it's, as Dr. Linas said, it's a race now. Can we get people vaccinated quickly enough so that we limit the opportunity for the variants to emerge? Or will there be vaccine hesitancy? Will the strains be particularly contagious? All the things that we just can't predict. And, we've been thrown a lot of, using sports analogies, we've been thrown a lot of curveballs between the beginning and now.
Dr. Linas, I know, in fact, you've shared with me a model that your school and the Boston Medical Center have contributed to on predicting when we might get to herd immunity by area. What's your latest thinking on, maybe broadly nationally, as well as in particular geographies? Are we getting close to herd immunity? How far away is that?
So the exact moment of herd immunity is a bit of an unknown, but we have been using simulation modeling to ask this question: if vaccines are proceeding at a given rate, when might we expect to be able to loosen up a bit on our non-pharmacologic interventions and still have the epidemic not come roaring back? And in general, the answer has been sometime late summer to early fall. But I also would say that that's not fated. It's in our control. It depends a lot on the pace of vaccination. And the one thing it's preliminary work now, but one thing that emerged from it that I think is true and that struck me is that really there's a lot of heterogeneity or differences between states. I hadn't really thought enough about that, I think, until we started putting that into our simulation model, that there really isn't one national story here. We have 50 states and 50 different epidemiologies. And actually, there can be big differences in when states are able to lift non-pharmacologic interventions based on the pace at which they're vaccinating, how many people have been vaccinated already, how large the population is, and sort of how fast the virus is transmitting in that state. So, but I think, the $64,000 question is, when might we be out? I'm hopeful that for the absent yet another curveball, sometime late summer, early fall.
So you both mentioned the variants and also the concept that the vaccines themselves may put pressure on the virus, which can actually result in the variants developing. Dr. Linas, maybe you could explain that a little bit. How does having the vaccine in process of being administered to the population in some ways actually contribute to some risk of more variants developing?
Sure, absolutely. There's a nice analogy actually to HIV medications, I think, that really the recipe for variants developing or for changes in the genome of a virus, they do it to some extent spontaneously. We expect this. It's not a surprise. But when you have the combination of pressure on the virus from something like a vaccine, which is holding back all the variants that are susceptible to the vaccine, where at the same time the virus is continuing to transmit and do its spontaneous mutations that it always will do, right? It's only the viruses that are not susceptible to the vaccine or less susceptible to the vaccine that then are able to flourish in that situation. And so it's this combination of selective pressure on some of the variants while letting other ones escape that pressure that can lead to rapid it doesn't increase the pace of mutation. It just allows the viruses which are resistant to the vaccine or less affected by the vaccine to really propagate without anything holding them back. Whereas the sensitive viruses all get the pressure from the vaccine and they can't replicate. So it's somewhat of a survival of the fittest kind of situation. It's really Darwinian if you're a virus, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So that's why it's critical to shorten this time, right? It's the time when you have some people vaccinated, but not everyone. That's the dangerous time. And we have to try to race through it as quickly as we can.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is important is every person when they get infected is actually making billions of copies of the virus. So the opportunity for the virus to mutate is almost unlimited, but and it happens very, very quickly. Dr. Rosenblatt, what are your thoughts, on how vaccines can be adapted to fight the variants? First of all, any thoughts on how effective the current vaccines are and whether or not maybe we'll need some modified vaccines to go after the emerging variants?
Thanks, Dan. Well, first of all, in terms of current vaccines, the current vaccines that we have are extraordinary. And in particular, the mRNA-based vaccines are really a whole new class. They weren't proven until now. And frankly, without going into the details of how they present to the immune system, we didn't know whether they would work at all. Remember, you can't get a vaccine for every disease. We still don't have one for HIV. Then, even if you get efficacy, you don't know what it's going to be. So imagine if we had efficacy of only 60, 70% for mortality or hospitalization. A vaccine would feel very differently. Its impact on behavior, on the economy would be very different. So these are really, I think, if not the best, amongst the best vaccines ever developed. They've now been in millions of people. No one's died from a vaccine, to our knowledge. Nobody's really had serious side effects. So they are extraordinary vaccines. An aspect of them that is quite favorable for the potential emergence of variants is that they are on a platform. And this platform can very rapidly be adapted to address new variants. You simply change the mRNA code when you get the genetic sequence of the virus or the strain that's emerging. You can very rapidly make a new vaccine. We don't think that vaccine is going to have to be tested in the same way that the vaccine for the first strain had to be tested. So things can move very quickly. And now we have in vitro and in vivo tests right prior to humans that actually correlate very well for neutralizing antibody and are very predictive. So these potential vaccines for the variants that we know about have already been made, and they're sitting on the shelf. And if we need them, they can go into manufacturing, testing, and production. A very different situation than is usually the case.
Well, that's great. And we received a lot of interesting questions from those who are watching today. We asked if they had questions when they filled out their registration forms. And one of those I wanted to ask, I'll address to you first, Dr. Rosenblatt, is what are the differences in the vaccines and do they provide equivalent protection? You know, I get this question myself all the time from, you know, friends and relatives. It's almost, I tell people, you're not picking out a wine, you're, you know, but, you know, any thoughts on, you know, how the vaccines compare to each other and should people be trying to get one or the other?
Well, I think at this point, they're not all, we don't have full supply for the population. These vaccines are all really good, and you should take whichever one you can get. I think that's the bottom line. In terms of saving lives and saving hospitalizations, they are all extremely effective. There are subtleties amongst the various groups. There's different knowledge base in terms of being conventional versus new technologies. But my feeling is we're really blessed with having vaccines that can protect the population. And I'd actually be interested to hear what Ben says on this.
I completely agree. I'm sort of animated in the corner because I would argue that the invention, especially these mRNA vaccines, is one of the single greatest achievements of modern science. It's really exciting stuff. And you know, I've sort of in other forms, it's almost like Star Trek kind of technology. It's truly innovative and exciting for all the reasons that Dr. Rosenblatt said. And the one reason that I've moderated the Star Trek analogy a bit is I do want to make clear to folks who are concerned, this technology is newish. But it's been the technology, the mRNA platform has been tested for a while now. And to some extent, actually, it's been waiting for the right moment to come forth and show its stuff, which COVID provided. But it's not as if this technology had never been used in a human before, and we're really all putting ourselves at risk. So as much as it is exciting, and I like to call it Star Trek because it feels like that, it's not that the entire process was done in 9 months. It's just that the entire application to COVID was done in about 9 to 11 months, which in and of its own right is quite remarkable. I mean, really incredible. I can't imagine. I can't think of another disease in which we've had this much progress this quickly. And it's a combination of these, you know, a long investment from NIH and pharma into the science, the basic science to make this possible. And the fact that the entire, you know, pretty much every scientist in the world paused what they were doing about a year ago and started focusing at least a little bit on this virus. And this is what we're capable of in the modern era.
Yeah, I think it really is incredible when you think about it, because in the past, it would have taken years, maybe many years to develop a new vaccine. But obviously a big part of this was that the platform work had already been done, lots of testing even on that. But when, you know, one question I hear a lot from people, they hear RNA, you know, they can RNA, DNA, people aren't 100% clear on the difference between the two. And people, you know, have heard and read about gene therapy, which can change your DNA. So they worry a little bit, wait a minute, am I getting something that's actually permanently changing my DNA? And of course it's not, but maybe Dr. Rosenblatt, could you explain a little bit what it really means to get an mRNA vaccine and what that really does inside your body?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Uh, but I just lost my thought for 1 second. I wanted to say something because we've been emphasizing the stunning speed of the development of these vaccines. We've never seen anything like it. But I also want to emphasize that no corners have been cut. These were really very well designed, very large clinical trials with tremendous surveillance, the collaboration of the government, CDC, FDA, BARDA, and independent safety review boards monitoring the large trials. So I know people worry when they hear about how fast this is. Did we cut corners? And I would say the answer is no. So importantly, these messenger RNA, since it is in the flow of genetic information from your DNA in the nucleus to your RNA in your cytoplasm to the proteins that get made as a result, these vaccines don't enter your nucleus. They do not change your genetic code. They don't become part of your genetic code. And so they have the code for the spike protein, which basically is what all of these vaccines are designed to do, to present spike protein to the immune system and your own immune system, and have your own immune system make neutralizing antibodies to that. One of the things that you don't hear much about, but are key to the success of these mRNA vaccines, is that messenger RNA, which is put into a little bubble, a bubble of lipid, of fat. And that bubble binds to the outside of a cell and delivers its package, its content of mRNA inside a cell, usually a muscle cell. And then the normal cellular apparatus for making and secreting proteins takes over. It reads that blueprint. It makes the spike protein. It's exactly the same spike protein as is in the virus, and nothing else of the virus. So there's not a lot, there's no extraneous information. There certainly isn't the capacity for it to run away and make virus. Interestingly, that little bubble not only is key for the delivery system, but it serves in a way as an adjuvant, which in vaccines means there's something that boosts the content to actually to get the immune system to rev up even more. So it's a wonderful combination. And I think people haven't spent as much time talking about the actual packaging, which took years for these companies to develop in the usual kind of high risk way in which drugs and vaccines are developed.
Yeah, and I think another thing to remember, and of course here we're talking about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are both the messenger RNA technology. Johnson & Johnson is a little bit of a different technology, but the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, I think most people recognize and have heard, have to be kept frozen and at very, very low temperatures. And that's just another way of saying this is a very fragile vaccine. So once it's injected into your bloodstream, obviously it's not being kept at frozen temperatures, it degrades very quickly. The vaccine does what it needs to do, sends a little recipe into some of your cells that make this spike protein, and then the vaccine is gone. It's not something that can linger in your body and do something else or something unexpected. So the fact that hundreds, I think more than 100 million doses of Moderna and Pfizer have already been delivered in the US and more than that worldwide. And, by now, if there were serious impacts, we would see that because the impacts would have to happen in all likelihood in a relatively short period of time. Now,
And
another.
if I could just add one little thing to that, because it is true that the vaccine is itself quite fragile. But before it was used in this, we didn't know. It turns out that when that messenger RNA gets into a cell, it starts pumping out the spike protein for a period of 2 to 4 weeks. If you just gave the spike protein and you injected it into somebody's arm, it would start to decompose immediately and probably be mostly gone by 72 hours. So we didn't know whether the continuous release of spike protein would be something that the immune system would get really excited about and make really good neutralizing antibodies, or maybe say, well, if it's constant production, that's different than what we see, and maybe we wouldn't get a good response. So it does get produced, the product gets produced for a period longer than the conventional vaccines do. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's why it tends to be so effective, 94, 95% effective. And one of the really nice surprises in all of this is it's been that same degree of efficacy even for older adults and the very elderly, something completely unexpected, I would say.
Well, thanks. That's really interesting, and just kind of thinking the way it works is fascinating. Switching gears a little bit, there's a lot of folks out there, including probably many of the people watching today, who've now had the vaccine. Dr. Linas, maybe you could start out. People often ask, once they've got the vaccine, they've had their 2 doses, waited a couple of weeks, what can they do now?
Yeah, sure. So congratulations to everyone who is in that state. And for the rest, for people who are hanging in there, keep hanging in there. The supply is coming. I know that in a lot of places, the rollout is not ideal. There is a feeling of Hunger Gamesness around it. And right now it is a little bit that if you hustle, you find vaccine. And if you don't have the wherewithal or the social capital to hustle, it's harder to find vaccine. I think we have to fix that. But when you are vaccinated, that is a reason to celebrate. And I think it is important that we start to recognize that post-vaccine life can and should look different than pre-vaccine life. I do think there's been a little bit, it's been a long year, and there's a certain degree of collective nihilism that at times I understand where it's coming from, but also sometimes I push back and say, man, we've made so much progress. It feels like we should be able to enjoy some of the wins. And so I think there's new CDC guidance on this. And in my estimation, it really comes down a lot between private spaces and public spaces. So if you're in a private space, it is absolutely appropriate now. And I would even argue you're to some extent sort of doing your duty towards society, getting back to normal, to start to see loved ones that you haven't seen, if everyone is vaccinated, to see friends and loved ones that you haven't seen. It is appropriate for folks to go to a dinner party with other vaccinated friends. And at that dinner party, you don't need to wear masks. At the same time, if you're in public, then we need to recognize that actually most people are not yet vaccinated. And in just about every simulation modeling study that I've seen, the New York Times did a piece on this, it's just true that if we stop wearing masks before the time comes, that more people will die, even as we're rolling out vaccine. So it's important that when we're in public spaces currently, we're still following our non-pharmacologic interventions, which is masking and distancing and hand sanitizing, as we have been all year. But in private spaces is where vaccinated people can start to come together without masks and start to return to something like life as normal, start to try to recover some of those relationships that we've all been missing for the past year. I saw there's some questions in Q&A around mixed vaccine company, right? And especially with kids. So if the grandparents are coming into the home and kids are not yet vaccinated, what should we make of that? That's a hard one. I do think that especially as we move forward into the summer, we hope, and I believe that as adults are increasingly vaccinated, the COVID case numbers should start coming down such that children in the short term are at least partially protected by effectively herd immunity, that there's just less COVID going around. So even though an individual child might be fully susceptible to COVID infection, the odds that the grandparent coming into the home who's vaccinated is carrying the virus are very low. In addition, even if a vaccinated person can transmit the virus, but we know that the vaccines all decrease that transmission somewhat. We're just not exactly sure how much. So that combination of less COVID going around in the community, less likely to be transmitting the virus in the home, and then also the fact that kids seem to be less likely to, the data show kids are less likely to get severe disease. I think it's, I think it's reasonable to be seeing grandkids and unvaccinated children in a private setting, even not wearing a mask, so long as you know that your risk outside of that house has been appropriate, right? So if you're just coming back from your Florida spring vacation, having gone to bars and nightclubs, I might not see children at that time, right? And give it 2 weeks because you might have been exposed even with vaccine. But if you know you've been wearing your mask and social distancing in public and you're going into a private home and your grandkids are there, that should be okay. If and then it's a risk benefit. Everyone has their own take on risk benefit. There's never zero risk. There is some risk that you could come in even if it's a vaccinated person and expose a child. If that risk is too high, then continue to for your comfort, then continue to wear a mask. Right. If you're vaccinated and masking, then I think your kid, the children in the room are really at infinitesimal or no effective risk. So I think it's time for people to start having those private interactions, seeing loved ones, seeing friends, and stay tuned as we have more and more people vaccinated. It'll start to become, hopefully this summer and the fall, maybe we can start to experiment with even more public loosening of non-pharmacologic interventions, even in public.
And I would add to that there's another dimension, the psychological or mental dimension, that even if your behavior is doesn't change because you're continuing to be safe and cautious, except for these private settings, I think many of us don't realize the stress that we've been living under for this past year. I'm fortunate, I've been vaccinated. I can tell you, it feels like a brain transplant. My whole attitude, my whole outlook has changed, even though I'm not modifying my behavior very much.
Yeah, I agree. And I've had experiences too because I'm vaccinated as a physician. It happened the other day. I went into a grocery store and it started getting crowded and there were lines and I started getting antsy. And, 6 months ago, I would have left on the spot and just left my cart in the aisle. And I went, wait, I don't have to do that. I've been vaccinated. And it was like 100 million pound weight coming off my chest. So, all of us are just waiting for the time that we all can experience that. I know it's been slower than we want it to be, but it's picking up. And I think we really should celebrate the fact that we have these incredibly effective vaccines and just work as hard as we can together to get everyone vaccinated.
And I think that's really great advice from both of you. And, common sense obviously has to be part of this. Also, the supply and availability of vaccine is clearly ramping up and may ramp up fairly dramatically in the next few weeks. So as you said, everybody should stick with it. It's probably going to feel a lot less like the Hunger Games over the next few weeks. I know I have not yet been vaccinated, but my wife and I now both have our appointments for next week. And even just getting the appointment felt like, a great milestone. Dr. Rosenblatt, maybe I'll address this one to you. When do you think children will be able to get vaccinated? And is that something that could happen before the start of school in the fall?
I think it could happen before the start of school, especially for the teenagers, sort of middle school and high school. Those clinical trials are already underway, and they should be finished by then. And given the speed with which it's the same vaccine, given the speed with which it's being made available, I think it's possible, not certain. And then there are already trials that are just starting for the younger age group, 6 months up to age 12. So it's happening. That's going to take a little longer, but of course those younger ones are the ones that are really at least risk for serious side effects. So I don't think that's going to impact as much as getting those teenagers for the next school year.
Okay, the next big category of questions that we've gotten is in regards to what the vaccine means for employers and society in general. I know that many of our employers, clients, and their representatives are watching this webinar, and they're trying to figure out if they can or should be requiring their employees to be vaccinated. And we've done a little bit of research on this. I'll share a little bit of what we've learned, even as an employer ourselves. It's a very complicated issue, and sort of half serious answer is it depends. There are several principles operating at the same time, and for sure you'll need your own legal counsel to make recommendations for your company and the unique situation that you may be in. All of the COVID-19 vaccines in use in the US right now are under what's known as emergency use authorization from the FDA. Generally speaking, that does make it more difficult for employers to make such vaccines a formal requirement. The manufacturers, however, are already beginning to file or soon will file for full authorization. So perhaps I think there's some filings going in perhaps next month, but generally the FDA doesn't commit to any timetable for those authorizations. But once there is full authorization, a lot of this dynamic changes from where it has been the past few months. Another key principle is fairness to the employee. If work can be done remotely, like we're doing right here, then requiring a vaccine isn't really an imposition that hurts the individual's employment or ability to do their job. The more complicated part is when there's not an ability to do the job without doing it in person. And then employers have to consider the health rights of employees versus the safety of other employees and customers. So there's another legal issue that may ultimately emerge, and potentially even OSHA standards around, are you taking reasonable care to create a safe workplace? And one of the ways to create a safe workplace is to surround people with other vaccinated people as opposed to with unvaccinated people who could put them at risk. There are precedents for vaccines for other illnesses and for professions ranging from emergency responders to camp counselors, and of course in schools where vaccines are required. But at this point, other than giving you sort of these thoughts here and these themes, we're all kind of left to navigate the employment law issues with our own legal counsel, also in the context of the particular state that you may be doing business in. And I don't know if Dr. Rosenblatt or Dr. Linas, if you had anything you'd want to add to that from your own experiences.
Well, I think the point you make, Dan, about the vaccines are currently under emergency use authorization, and that's a more gray zone. It's an important technicality, and I'm not a lawyer, but let's imagine for the sake of discussion that full FDA approval comes in the not too distant future. Then school systems have the right to require you to be vaccinated. I know pediatricians' offices say, you can't, if your kids aren't vaccinated, they can't come to my waiting room. So you need to find a different pediatrician, all of which is to say that an employer does have the right, if they choose to exercise it, to mandate vaccination. If somebody can't, they should try to accommodate, as you said, to work remotely. But if that's not possible, they do have the right to require vaccination. And it's important to remember that at the workplace, there may be people who are immunocompromised, who you don't necessarily know about. The vaccine's 95% effective. That means 1 out of 20 people is not fully protected. And so what are the rights of those people? We don't know who we are, right? People are vaccinated. We don't know if we're in the 95% or the 5%. So I think it's a balancing act. I know there's discussion about, and now I'm really getting off my expertise about, there may be religious reasons, but the mRNA vaccines, they are not porcine based. They are not made from fetal tissue originally. So many of the religious objections fall away. And so I don't have an answer except to say from the little bit I've read about this, if one wants to, once it's fully approved, if an employer wants to require that, that's within the rights of the employer.
Okay, well, certainly something a lot of the folks watching are very interested in and trying to learn more about, because obviously in making a safe workplace, you want to make those right decisions with the latest information. Dr. Linas, one thing that's been very interesting and concerning, and you mentioned this earlier, is that there's been a great variance in how many people are getting vaccinated based on economic status and even location. And we see dramatic differences. You mentioned state to state. It's actually within a state, there can be tremendous differences from one community to another. So do you see at this point, has there been equity in getting vaccines out to different populations? And if not, what are some of the things we can do about that?
Yeah, so that's easy. No, there's not. There's clearly equity gaps in the way the vaccine rollout has happened. I think many of us are upset to see that. There's some sense of here we go again. How can we not get it right this time? And to some, I agree. Although also I would point out that probably it was naive to imagine that just because we care more this time, we're going to be able to suddenly undo decades, arguably centuries of structural issues and structural racism that we have that are leading to this lack of equity in the vaccine rollout. And so really, one should expect, like, probably with vaccine rollout, which is a very high stakes and important thing, all of those same structures of inequity that have been come into play all along are still at play. We haven't erased them in the last 6 months just because we've been talking about it more. So it's not surprising to me that there's been a major problem with equity in vaccine rollout. And I think there's a variety of things we need to do. Part of it is about supply and making sure that vaccine is accessible in the communities where people aren't being vaccinated. So I can speak, for example, in Massachusetts, some of the state-led mass vaccination sites really aren't located in areas that are easily accessible to communities of color, certainly around in the Boston area. If you just look at the map, you can see they're not that close to the neighborhoods that are largely immigrant and people of color. And if you look at the public transportation map, they look even further away. But it's more than just access. There's some statistics I've seen from communities where, for example, 80% of the population is Latinx, but only 2% of them have been vaccinated. That's about more than just access. That's going to require a comprehensive strategy. We need to be thinking about trusted voices and trusted messages and new approaches to getting out, to addressing some of the concerns around the vaccine, and to building momentum, because it's not going to fix itself. And it's not going to get better with just opening up more clinics in underserved areas. I think it's going to take a more proactive approach to working on equity in the vaccine. Because it's just, we've all seen this pandemic has just come down unequally on on racial minorities and immigrant populations in America. And we need to try to rectify that. Or an equal vaccine rollout is not what we need. We need an equitable vaccine rollout, which means that we're prioritizing vaccine rollout to the communities that are the hardest hit and that are at the highest risk of severe COVID and death. So I really think that's an important message going forward. And it is upsetting. It's not surprising when there's a strictly limited or very scarce resource. The people who have the wherewithal to hustle are always going to find success. But I'm hopeful that as the vaccine becomes more available, it might start to become a little bit easier so that you don't need to have 5 family members online for you all night and also calling your 6 friends who are physicians to see if one of them might be able to swing you a special spot. Right? I think we've all heard stories like that. That stuff is happening now. And I think it's really important. And at the personal level, one thing people can do to contribute to this is wait your turn, right? It's not going to be that much longer. And for most people, getting vaccinated today versus getting vaccinated in early May is not actually a huge difference. Be safe in the meantime. You can keep yourself safe and wait for your turn. And when it's your turn, do what you can to get the vaccine. but jumping the line isn't helping. And so just be patient. We're getting there. It's rolling out, but it's important that we do it in an equitable way.
One thing that was done right in terms of equity were the clinical trials. So if we hadn't tested minority populations in the clinical trials, there would be very little credibility in then the actual implementation and vaccination. And so I know the Moderna trial well, and of the 30,000 people tested, 3,000 were African American and 6,000 were Latinx. So and they actually delayed the trial because they had an imbalance in enrollment waiting, and they slowed it down in order to accrue enough enrollees from minority groups so that they would have an appropriate composition of the population tested at the end. So I think that was very important. And of course, those subgroups have been analyzed, and there are no differences in terms of the performance of the vaccine across these different groups.
Yeah, and
I agree.
go
ahead.
Go ahead, Ben.
I wanted to add one point there because I'm involved in the research effort more on therapeutics than on vaccine, but my hospital and I've been involved with some of the vaccine trials early on, and I agree. At the same time, I'm not ready to give us in the research community in the research world a gold star yet on our approach to diversity and inclusion in research and in therapeutic trials. It's People of color are uniformly underrepresented in therapeutic trials, and they were underrepresented even in the Moderna study, right? Because 10% participation is not the representation of African Americans in the pandemic. So there's a lot of work to be done there, right? And the research community needs to think long and hard about that. And I'll just add that one problem I would propose now that we need to think about is that if you're involved with clinical research, clinical trials, there's a huge emphasis placed on the expedience of the trial and how quickly sites are able to enroll participants. Obviously, that's very, very important. It's clear why that should matter to anyone running a clinical trial. However, at times, that is the metric and the only metric, expediency. And actually, there's not currently a lot of focus on who's being enrolled and which sites might be leading and enrolling underrepresented groups. And so we need to think about that because actually, right, those things, there's financial implications for that. If you're doing research, you need to have a fiscally solvent research operation. And if your site's being shut down because it's under enrolling, if you're not being reimbursed the way you're supposed to be because you haven't been able to enroll enough patients, and yet you're contributing a lot of diversity to the trial, right? It sounds like a very niche issue, but it basically kills research operations in safety net hospitals and in communities of color because the only sort of metric by which you're measured is expediency. So we do need to think about this, about how we're getting folks into trials and working with the communities so that there's more interest in participating because there's still a lot of distrust of the research community.
I think they're really critical points. And as you said, there are ways we can help. And certainly one of the most obvious is to make sure we, don't jump the line. We wait our turn. We go to places that are near us. We're not going to vaccine centers that are meant for underserved communities. And we'll all have the chance to get the vaccine if we haven't already very, very soon. This is going to go very quickly from here. We have questions coming in on live from the audience, and a few of them relate to the relationship between getting vaccinated and having had COVID. So I'll ask, it's kind of two questions. One is, if you've had COVID in the past, do you still need to get vaccinated? And then the second question someone asked is, if you've just been diagnosed with COVID, should you rush out to get a vaccine because maybe it can help you with the illness, or do you need to wait some period of time before you're vaccinated? And I'll throw that open to whoever would like to take that.
Those are fairly clear answers. I think we can be succinct. So if you have had past COVID, you should still be vaccinated. The reason is because the immunity you get from the vaccine is a little different than the immunity you get from the native infection. And actually, it turns out it's more durable and potentially even more effective. So yes, get vaccinated. If you have current or recent COVID, we're saying that you should wait a little while before you get the vaccine, 3 weeks, a month. So don't run out and get vaccinated while you're still sick, but don't take yourself out of the vaccination pool because it's still important to be vaccinated.
Okay, the last thing I wanted to cover today is what this may all mean for the future and maybe the potential of other pandemics. So, a lot of people have compared this to the Spanish flu in 1918. So it's 103 years later. Do we think that, that's just sort of the natural course of these things and we're good now for another 103 years? Or is the frequency of pandemics going to become, more frequent than that kind of period? Maybe start with Dr. Rosenblatt.
Oh, I think that the betting odds are that they're going to become much more frequent. The population has increased in size. The interface between humans and the natural world has increased in size. Travel is fast around the world. And so I think all of those things conspire, and climate change is going to also have an impact on this. So there are a number of factors lining up, all of which point in the direction of more frequent epidemics and pandemics.
I completely agree. Even in my professional lifetime, so sort of in the 21st century, we had SARS-1, which people may or may not remember, which was just roll the dice luck that didn't, right? That virus turned out to be just a little bit too fatal to really take off as a global pandemic. MERS was another coronavirus that's still out there. That's another one that, it's just a little too fatal to become a global pandemic. So we're on our third coronavirus potential pandemic in the last 20 years. This one happened to hit the sweet spot. So I think I agree. I think that there's a lot of factors pointing toward more global infectious diseases.
So are we prepared now that we've done everything that we've done on COVID-19? Are we prepared for the next one? Dr. Rosenblatt.
I would give an emphatic no. I think we weren't prepared for this one. It's very clear. I would say the one thing that these epidemics do is that they induce the side effect of amnesia in policymakers. And people don't, once we get through this, I'm hoping it's not the case for this, but how many people have had the word Zika cross their lips in the last year or two, or Ebola? And we were really worried about those things 4 years ago, 6 years ago. So we have this tendency, and especially now with this great scientific victory, maybe we think, gee, we can respond really quickly to all of them. My own feeling is that what we're trying to do is a very difficult thing in order to prepare. Yes, you need PPE, yes, you need ventilators, all of those things. But if you look at how we're really getting out of this situation, it's by invention, it's innovation, it's new vaccines. And we really should have a stockpile, a global stockpile for all of the known lethal pathogens, whatever the number is, 20, 25 or so. We should have been doing this after 9/11 when we're worried about bioterrorism, because many of these are the same pathogens. And when we don't know the pathogen, like coronavirus, we have platforms that could rapidly move in this direction. So we're trying to put this on the back of the health system, but the health system is designed to squeeze on efficiency, get costs really down. I think that my firm, Flagship, thinks a lot about this, something called health security, like homeland security. You would have reserve doctors. You would have stockpile, the way the military does. Military has 2 million people on the ready. It's got reservists. It has stockpiles of weapons and things. We should approach our defense against the disease in the same way, which is make a national allocation so that we can be secure about our health in the way we feel secure in walking around the homeland.
I agree. And as one last point, I would concur with all of that. And also say I think that we need to put into place some sort of governance and some processes about how we're going to approach the next one. So that, right, are we going to use the Defense Appropriations Act? I would argue we should. It's been remarkably successful since it's been employed with the new administration. But right, so we're not going back through some of these most basic principles of how government reacts to pandemic the next time we have pandemic. And instead we can fall back on our plan. because this time we spent a year inventing first principles, and I think we're coming back to where we needed to be. But we should be ready the next time, so we're not arguing with each other about whether or not this is the time to invoke certain policies.
Great. Well, lots to think about there, certainly. And then, of course, in the shorter term, lots of reason for optimism, especially with the vaccines becoming plentiful. So thank you, Doctors Linas and Rosenblatt. Really, really interesting conversation. I know the people watching really enjoyed that as well. So thanks again, and look forward to other conversations in the future. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.